Good evening, and welcome to 7 Stories Up. We are delighted to have you all joining us at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library. My name is Cynthia Chaldekas, and I'm a librarian here at SNFL. And before I introduce tonight's guest, I'd like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library for making programs like this possible. I'd also like to remind you, if you don't have a library card, they're easy to get. You can just speak to one of my colleagues outside the door at the end of the program or go to any of the information desks on the floors below. And finally, I'd like to encourage you to visit NYPL's website, take a look at upcoming 7 Stories Up programs. I deeply understand how people feel about their cars. I'm originally from Detroit. For the longest time considered the car capital of the world. In 1982, I gave that all up and moved to Brooklyn, New York, where I still live. Back then, my subway route from Brooklyn to work in the city took me over the Manhattan Bridge. I loved my route. Looking out the window, I had a world-class view of the New York City skyline as my train trundled across the bridge. And the ride was just long enough for me to make some headway into whatever I was reading at the time. In the early 80s, subway cars inside and out were covered with graffiti. I can still remember marveling at the contrast of folks like me going to work with their backs against walls covered completely in illegible black scribble. That said something about the city. I just wasn't sure what. On the trains, I've experienced every kind of delay for the worst and best possible reasons. 35 years ago, I myself, in full labor, almost delivered my first baby on the train. That would have been a delay too. Tonight, I'm very excited about our program with Nicole Gelinas and Sam Schwartz, who will be discussing Nicole's book, Movement, New York's Long War to Take Back Its Streets from the Car. Nicole Gelinas is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor to City Journal, and a columnist for the New York Post. She frequently writes opinion pieces for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and other publications. Sam Schwartz is the CEO of Sam Schwartz Pedestrian Traffic Management and a Ted Keel Fellow at Hunter College. He wrote a column on transportation for the New York Daily News for many years, and most of us know him as Gridlock Sam. Please welcome Nicole Gelinas and Sam Schwartz.
Well, what a great crowd came out to hear you today. Did everybody pay your $9 congestion fee? We hope you made your contribution to the MTA. If not, hope you took the subway. I'm really delighted to be here to discuss movement with Nicole Gelinas. She did share the book with me while she was working on it. She did spend some time in my basement poring over old documents when I started with the old traffic department in 1971. So she got to see the real documents there. You know, she's a writer. You heard that she writes for the New York Times, for the Post, for others. To those of us in the transportation profession, she is a must read. We eagerly wait to hear and read Nicole's take on various issues, and today we'll get into them. When she asked me to write something about the book, I thought the book was so terrific that I assigned it to all my students. And I thought it's one of the best history books on New York City transportation and, in fact, New York City politics. What I wrote, and this is only part of it, it's simply the best book on explaining the history of our physical city, the protagonists and the obstructionists, viewed through the nuances of the times. So often we decide somebody's good or bad, but we don't put ourselves back in the time period in evaluating them, and Nicole does some time travel for us. It's been 50 years since The Power Broker was published. This book, your book, will undoubtedly serve as the definitive treatise on New York City transportation for the next 50 years. Quite a book, quite an achievement. Now, since I mentioned The Power Broker, right, since I mentioned the Power Broker by Robert Caro, what are the major differences between your take on Robert Moses and Caro's take on Robert Moses?
Sure. Thank you, Sam, and thank you to Cynthia and the New York Public Library. I'm honored to be here at the library doing an event. So one of the reasons I started writing this book back in 2018 was that if you are in the transportation profession, if you are writing about transportation, if you have the privilege of speaking to elected officials, appointed officials, transportation experts such as Sam, you will hear over and over that we live in the city that Robert Moses built. That you point to a parkway and say, Moses built the parkway with the bridges too low, so you can't have bus transit on the parkway. Or point to something like the Cross Bronx Expressway and say, Moses cut the Bronx in half. And there's an element of truth to this, of course, but there's also an element of excuse making. That if you blame Moses for New York City's physical landscape, you are letting yourself off the hook, and you're letting previous generations of elected officials off the hook for decisions that they made and that they continue to make. So Moses has been dead for close to 4.5 decades, and Moses has been out of power for close to 60 years. So Moses has been out of power longer than he ever had his supposed autocratic power. And if we think about New York, starting in the 20th century in 2 chunks of time, roughly World War I to the mid-1960s, was the age where the automobile was ascendant in the city, and city officials were trying to remake the city around the automobile instead of forcing the automobile to fit into the city. Starting in the 60s, we stopped doing that. We stopped building new highways, for the most part. There are some exceptions, as with everything. And we started gradually to rebuild the transit system that we had neglected for half a century. And eventually that set the conditions for things like bike lanes, bus lanes, pedestrian plazas. So we've actually had more time since Moses was in power and more time since the automobile was ascendant than all of that time when the automobile was in its ascendancy. So I just thought something interesting must have happened during these 6 decades. Rather than obsess about the Moses era, let's talk about what we've done since then, and let's also stop blaming one person for New York's physical landscape. Back in the 70s, a lot of people wanted to blame Moses to get themselves off of the hook for decisions that they made, people in the Wagner administration, people in multiple eras of New York City planning, the business community, the real estate community, much of the press. Blaming Moses was very convenient to absolve them of any responsibility, but we also do that today. If some elected official says to you, we can't do much about this because Moses built it, talking about something like the Cross Bronx Expressway, well, why is that? Moses if he ever was in charge of us, he's certainly not in charge of us anymore. So when you were talking about Moses, you are not talking about what you could be doing to undo some of what happened in the New York City landscape in the middle or through the middle of the 20th century.
Okay, thank you. Well, Moses wasn't the only figure to almost have mythical qualities, stature, in the Caro book. Jane Jacobs emerges, and we almost have this good versus evil equation there. How do you see it? Was Jane Jacobs really this mythical character?
Yeah, I think it's a very simplistic reading. And I should also say, this is not a criticism of the Power Broker. The Power Broker is treated as the Bible, and so much of what we hear about Moses it is people's reading of the power broker. It is not the literal word-for-word text of the power broker. And much like the Bible, you can take away anything you want from it. By this point, it is canonical, and nobody can complain about your interpretation. So it is more a criticism of taking this as the only text of what defines New York City 20th century history. So on Moses versus Jacobs, like any myth, there's an element of truth to it, but like any myth of the gods, it is also highly simplistic. Just as Moses was not the uber villain of the 20th century, the decisions Moses made had the full backing of elected officials in New York City and New York State. He could not have built anything, starting with the Triborough Bridge, unless he had state legislative permission, city government permission, city planning commission, and so forth. Jane Jacobs did not single-handedly defeat Moses. If you think of the canonical battle between Moses and Jacobs, it was the battle over the Lower Manhattan Expressway, where Moses wanted to foist a 10-lane elevated expressway across SoHo, obliterate much of Little Italy, the western side of what is now some of the most valuable residential real estate on the planet. Moses was sort of doing this in secret and unveiling this and circumventing democracy and pushing through his project. Well, that was not the case. The Wagner administration approved this project. It was actually approved multiple times. Just like when any project has a lot of opposition and division, Wagner, the mayor throughout the 1950s, when this was going through the approval process, he delayed. He didn't want to make a decision to anger either side, so he would come up with new reasons for delay after delay after delay until he was finally out of office, so he could satisfy the people who wanted it built and satisfy the people who didn't want it built. So you go into the Lindsay administration, this is still on the planning books as something to be built. And the opposition in Greenwich Village and Soho is growing by the day. Jane Jacobs, of course, was the face of that opposition, but she only learned the technique of beating Moses from a battle that had taken place a decade before. In some people's minds, because this is all ancient history by now, these projects are mixed up in people's heads as one project, but they are very separate projects. So back in the 50s, before the battle of the Lower Manhattan Expressway, there was an earlier battle of the city parks department under Moses wanting to widen an existing road through Washington Square Park. This was the Manhattan Transportation Battle of the 1950s. So who stopped that project and actually did something very difficult, which was getting the existing road in Washington Square Park, deleting that and getting rid of it? Very, very rare to get rid of an existing road. That was led by a woman named Shirley Hayes. She was a homemaker, former off-Broadway actress, lived in the village, kind of a village gentrifier, we would call her now, wife of an advertising executive, very intelligent, but not sophisticated in the ways of city and state government. She had 4 young children. They played in Washington Square Park. She was sitting out in the park one day, reading her New York Times. She saw the city's gonna widen this road and sink this road through Washington Square Park to allow more through traffic to go through Lower Manhattan. And she said, no, that's not a good idea. We're not going to do this. It was a 15-year battle, but she won. And how did she win would become very important to the later Lower Manhattan Expressway battle, which is you don't beat Moses by focusing on Moses. You know, she wrote some letters to the Parks Department. She wrote some letters to Moses. He wouldn't give her the time of day, just like he acted with everybody. But she understood very early, you put the pressure on the elected officials. She gathered the signatures of 1/3 of the village's adult population, very consistently put pressure on the borough president and the mayor, Mayor Wagner, and had made a credible threat that this large block of people focused on this one issue could make a difference in district and in city elections. So she got Wagner to back down and call Moses off. That's exactly the lesson that Jane Jacobs, she was a volunteer in this battle. She was not a leader of the battle. And Jane Jacobs actually made some mistakes in this earlier battle. She was all in favor of compromise. And Shirley Hayes said, no, we're not going to compromise, because as long as there's a road in Washington Square Park, there's always going to be someone who wants to widen that road. So the no compromise position won. And 10 years later, Jane Jacobs took these lessons to heart. So a long way of saying, killing the Lower Manhattan Expressway had nothing to do with beating Moses. It was putting consistent pressure on Mayor John Lindsay. By 1969, Lindsay himself, going into his second term election, was in a lot of trouble. He needed these votes in Greenwich Village. These are the people who had brought him to the mayoralty earlier. Keeping the consistent, sustained pressure on Lindsay, and it was Lindsay in 1969 who declared that the expressway was dead for all time. He had the full authority to do that, and once he had done that, there was no. Of course, Moses was gone by then, partly because Lindsay fired him from his city positions. So, just a way of saying that these decisions are always in the hands of the elected officials, who are in turn accountable to the electorate. Hiding behind someone like Moses, or today something like a public authority, that's just to distract people. If you keep your eye on who makes these decisions and who is accountable, you can, and people have, won these great battles over and over.
That's terrific. And I note that there were the mothers in the 50s, and they made a point of saying mothers of the 60s. And you have, later on in your book, contemporary mothers against the ghost of Moses. Is there something about mothers that get the job done when it comes to fighting highways?
I think it's a little bit of a marketing gimmick and a little bit of a generalization. Obviously, anybody can successfully start a community coalition, build up and work with other coalitions to get a project done, or to stop a project. Actually easier to stop a project, which we can get into later for various reasons. But I think mothers in the 1950s in particular, you see many battles where it was actual mothers who beat Moses, including the playground for a parking lot in Central Park. Again, generalization, but many of these women were educated women who 30 years later would have been in the workforce. You know, they would have been doctors, they would have been lawyers, they would have been, like Shirley Hayes' husband was, an advertising executive, because they were full-time homemakers, full-time taking care of the children. They could put this thinking to work outside of the workforce, but these were full-time jobs. I mean, Shirley Hayes, 30 years after this, said this was a 50-hour-a-week job in putting together this group for years and years and years to beat this road. So if you are just struggling to survive, if you are a single parent, or you don't have this extra time to participate in all of these community meetings, much, much, much harder to devote your time to these issues.
Great. Well, there is an issue and a drama that is unfolding this very moment, and that is congestion pricing. We know the President of the United States made it clear he's going to end it. He said, called himself a king in his X tweet on it. And he said it would end on March 21st. So I thought we would have a different discussion today about it. And then I don't know if he blinked, but now it's going to be April 20th, I think, is the drop dead date. What do you think about the program so far, and what do you have a prognosis that it survives or not?
Yeah, and Sam, I think I think you would agree, it's interesting to see how New York City is becoming much more of a foil for President Trump on the national stage than it was the first term around. And congestion pricing obviously a big part of that. So how is the program working 2.5 months in? I'd like to hear your thoughts on this as well, but I think it's working well. Clearly, from the perspective of cutting traffic into and within core Manhattan, traffic is down. I mean, you don't really need a study on that. You can just walk around. You know, oftentimes you don't have to stop at the intersections anymore to wait for cars. It's almost like it's a parade day where there's just so few of them. You can just look carefully and just continue on your way crossing the street. We don't see as much blocking the box where pedestrians are threading their way into these stalled cars. So, and it is backed by the data. You know, the number of vehicles entering Manhattan last month was 8.5% below what the MTA estimates it was last year. Now, that's if you live in Manhattan. If you take transit into Manhattan, the buses from New Jersey, the buses from Brooklyn are also operating much more quickly and gaining ridership. The buses from Staten Island as well. And interestingly, even people who drive regularly into Manhattan, 2/3 of them said they like this. They'd rather pay the $9 than sit in traffic and have a much less reliable commute. But that is not the whole picture. We still don't have official data on whether this is diverting traffic across the Bronx. I think the good news is the study that your students at Hunter did shows that it's not. It'd be good to have some data from the MTA. Be good to go through a full summer and see what happens. Another good piece of news is it does not appear to be causing more traffic injuries or deaths. I think one concern was with the cars moving more quickly in Manhattan, speed kills. But so far that's not showing up in the data. Number of fatalities in South Manhattan, same as it was last year, which is 4 for the first 2.5 months of the year. 4 too many, but certainly good that we haven't seen an increase. I don't think that changes what the political equation is, which is many people are resentful of Manhattan for many reasons, good and bad, and they see this as a tax to get into Manhattan, even if they don't come into Manhattan or want to come into Manhattan. They just resent the idea that they would be charged to come into Manhattan. And that is what the president is tapping into. This is clearly one of his campaign pledges, clearly picked up some swing votes over this issue. But I think you're right. I think he did blink in that extra 30 days grace period for an order that the governor and the MTA was ignoring anyway, because he does not have a terrific case in revoking federal approval for a project that was just federally approved just a few months ago. A judge is not likely to look kindly on none of the underlying facts have changed, but you are taking away approval after the project has started. There are other ways he can punish us for going on with the program, but the longer it's in operation and the more people get used to it, I think that risk recedes. And even if he does succeed, he is not going to be the president forever.
Okay, well, there was, some people may doubt you on that one. You had an interesting stat there that it's kind of mind-blowing, and that is that the people that are paying the fee, 2/3 of them like it.
And it's because if you think about who drives into Manhattan, there's the issue of public sector employees who drive at twice the level that private sector employees drive. But if you leave them aside for the moment, if you are driving regularly into Manhattan, you are paying to park. You're probably paying $40 a day at least to park in a garage. Even if you find a space on the street in core Manhattan, the city's parking rates are actually pretty competitive. You know, you're paying $6, $7, $8, $9. And you are already paying bridge tolls, tunnel tolls from New Jersey. So this is not, it didn't go from free to $9. It went from some level of cost to an extra $9. But what you're getting for the extra $9 is a much more reliable commute where you don't have to leave 20 minutes early to make sure you get there on time. The numbers show the distribution of how long it takes has really gotten much tighter. You know, you don't have this uncertainty, and people hate uncertainty. And just, you know, if you are being paid, you know, more than city's minimum wage, which at this point is going up close to $20, a half an hour of your time sitting in traffic is a valuable $9.
Right.
It is people who drive in less frequently. You know, maybe you take your family in to see a play once every 6 months. And this, you have to save up money for this. This is a significant cost. And here is the state of New York coming and dunning you for another $9, which I think causes a more opposition. And the argument that this actually solved the transit system's financial problems, kind of not true, and that inevitably, as the MTA has to go back and ask for more billions of dollars, that also harms support of the program.
Okay. This week marks kind of a sad milestone, and that is the 5-year anniversary of the lockdown that we had in New York City due to COVID. And how did that change the street system? And what do you think is going to remain? What do you think will continue to be part of? What did we gain, and are we losing something as well?
Yeah, I think it's half a good news story and half a bad news story. That the pandemic lockdown pointed up the value of what we had done to improve life and improve safety on the streets in the 40 years leading up to the pandemic. So things like the bike lanes that had been built beginning in the Bloomberg administration and actually had a history of the city trying to build them going back to the Koch years. Having protected bike lanes and having a municipal bike share program meant that if people were afraid to take the subway because of COVID and subway ridership went down to 7% of normal at one point, they could get on a city bike, they could ride across the bridge, feel relatively safe and comfortable doing that. And we saw City Bike was the first form of organized transportation to recover to pre-COVID levels very, very quickly, 6 figures a day of people riding City Bike. So that was very important to getting people to essential workplaces. I think things like the argument that had already been partially won, that the street is not just for a car, whether it's a moving car or a parked car, that made doing something like open restaurants much easier. You know, if you hadn't had Bloomberg do things like pedestrianize a part of Jackson Heights or pedestrianize Times Square, de Blasio never could have said, we're going to take tens of thousands of parking spaces and make them into restaurants. And this was very important economically because these restaurants were just, as de Blasio told me for the book, they were going out of business if he didn't do this. So I think those things were good. I think the less good side was the crime that exploded on the subways starting in the spring of 2020. It took a very long time for the city under 2 administrations to start to get a handle on this problem. It's just right now that we're starting to maybe get back to pre-pandemic crime levels. So that kept people off the subway much longer than they needed to be off the subway. So kind of tale of 2 cities, but absolutely the one thing that COVID did not prove is that we are not going to become a car-oriented city. In fact, when people did start driving in larger numbers because they were afraid for a while, both of COVID and the crime on the transit system, you just started to have unsustainable traffic jams. You had worse traffic outside of Manhattan than you had ever had before. And it proves that the transit system may have to be different to acknowledge that people commute differently. They're not commuting 5 days a week. But we are still going to be a transit-based, walking-based, bicycle-based city.
Right. Talking about the transit system, you have an odd take on something that most people would see as a negative, and you see it as a positive, maybe the outcome, and that was the transit strike, which I doubt if most people here remember, but I do. The transit strike of 1966. Why do you have a positive take on what happened?
Yeah, I think it's actually, this is something I learned from researching and writing the book, that the transit strike of 1966 did more than any academic report, than any business community study could have done to show people, to show the press, to show elected officials that the city just does not run without mass transit. I mean, this was the era, 1966 was the time when we were rethinking building highways. This was when the Lower Manhattan Expressway was still in play as a live project, the first year of the Lindsay administration. And you still had people saying, the future is the car. We need to work on getting more people into Manhattan by car. Well, when the Transport Workers Union went out on strike on January 1st, that proved that people could not get into Manhattan by car. You move that ceiling where more than a quarter or so of all people trying to get into core Manhattan are trying to do so on cars, and it just shuts down. It's just a matter of physics. It's not a matter of ideology or the environment or people should like mass transit. It's just they physically do not fit in the space. So you could shut the bridges and tunnels down, and most people could still get into Manhattan. But when you shut the transit system that brings 3 out of 4 people in, Manhattan just does not work. And so that, if you watch some of these state and city council hearings surrounding the transit strike, you had Robert Moses saying, well, the bridges and tunnels, they worked perfectly during the strike, and everybody else was saying, no, they didn't. And this was at the time when Lindsay was saying, we need to take some of the surpluses from Robert Moses's bridges and tunnels and use them to fund mass transit. That argument got a lot more traction once people saw, what does the city look like when we don't have a transit system? So I think having a strike once a generation or so is actually good for, and we may be due for one, and the last one was 20 years ago.
1980, yeah.
On the other hand, more people can work from home today. They could not do so in 1966. So very interesting to see, people riding roller skates, people riding skateboards, people riding their children's bikes. I mean, they could not, Lindsay said, stay home, but if you stayed home, you were basically telling your boss, my job is not very important. And so no one wanted to stay home, even for one day.
Yeah, Ed Koch told everybody to come in.
Yes, and that was a
Yeah.
big difference in how the psychology of the city had changed. 1966, defeatist, people feeling like the city was losing, and by the mid-'80s, or the early '80s at that time, city being back on the upswing and starting to regain population.
A different question, I can't go anywhere where people don't bother me about the deliveristas. And yesterday, sadly, there was a fatality. A 49-year-old man was struck by a deliverista bike. In your book, you talked about a period that I remember well, and that was the messenger period. And people were mad at the messengers because they were going as fast as they could. And you mentioned a kind of a solution there, that they couldn't be gig workers, they had to be employees, and as a result, the people that owned the courier services had to pay workman's comp insurance. And after that passed, the number of crashes went dramatically down. Is that a solution for deliveristas
Yeah,
now?
it's at least part of the solution. The e-bike food deliveries. Of course, we've always had bicycle deliveries of food, but until the advent of these apps, Uber Eats, DoorDash, and all the rest, this was, your local restaurant would have a delivery person. You'd call on the phone. If they were within a few blocks, they'd bring the food over, and you'd pay a little tip to the person who delivered it. With the apps and the legalization of the e-bikes, you have people who are contract workers riding these bikes miles and miles to make a delivery. If they don't do a certain amount of deliveries, they're kicked off the app, so they lose their livelihood. And there's a certain amount of regulatory arbitrage here that the state lets them get away with saying, these are not employees, these are contract workers. If the Department of Labor said they're employees, you solve a lot of the problem, because then they have to provide workman's comp, they have to provide insurance for injury or fatalities. By adding those costs, you shrink this business because it cannot operate with that level of cost. You know, there's only so much money people are going to pay for having this food delivered. But I also think more broadly, the e-bike revolution, as it has played out in practice in New York City, has not been very good for traditional bicycle riding and support of pedal bikes. The e-bike is a motorized vehicle. It is much heavier and much more powerful than a traditional bike. There has to be some level of registration and insurance. Doesn't have to be the same level as for a car or a truck, but acknowledging these are not your old-fashioned pedal bicycles, and we have to have a different way of regulating them on the street. And as it is, they've basically pushed the pedal bicyclists out of the bike lanes.
Including me on my pedal bike.
Yeah, and of course, the argument to that is you need a wider bike lane. Yes, you do, but without some sense of discipline, both on the apps and on the cyclists themselves, you're just giving people more room to go the wrong way and to run red lights. You know, both of these things have to happen at the same time. There has to be some acknowledgement that there is more responsibility if you are driving a motorized vehicle that's exceeding 20 miles an hour, which is, of course, the speed limit on many city streets.
Going into the future, autonomous vehicles are now operating in San Francisco, even Los Angeles and Arizona, and they're very eager to come into the New York market. Do you think that we will see them, and do you think they'll be helpful going forward?
Well, and I get most of this from you, because you wrote your own book about this, which I would encourage.
Plug my book.
Yeah, I would encourage everyone to read, and I'm sure it's available from the library. That this is just like with Uber and Lyft, and just like, for that matter, with the mass market production of the automobile 120 years ago. This is a matter of, do we let the technology be in charge of us, or are we going to be in charge of the technology? So, as you say in your book, the apocalyptic case for driverless cars is, I have 2 kids that are going to 2 different after-school activities. So I order a different car and put each kid in a different car. And I myself am also going somewhere. So I've gone from 1 car to 3 cars on the road at the same time. Or I forgot to pick something up and I send the car to the supermarket to pick that up and get it for me. So unless you have a very high price on the mileage use of these autonomous cars, you create more traffic and more congestion instead of less. And so the city can't make the same mistake as it made with Uber and Lyft and say, well, we don't want to be anti-tech. We have to do what the tech industry tells us. You want a counter-cyclical force to push back and say, yes, there's a place for them, but they are not going to set their own rules, including things like retiming traffic lights so that they can move more quickly through an urban environment. You know, you could see a scenario where somebody says, well, they don't see pedestrians very well, so this is now going to be the responsibility of the pedestrians. You know, you don't want that to happen. The limitations of the tech should limit the tech. They should not mean we redesign the streets around them.
Yeah, I recall some MIT students that were inventing something for pedestrians to wear to notify the car
Right.
that they have work. That's not the way you'd be recommending. You do write about, you have a chapter, in fact, fear train to pack train securing New York's subways. And you recently penned an op-ed that appeared in the New York Times on this. So what would be your advice to the next mayor coming in, to any of the mayoral candidates, on a platform position to reduce crime in the subway that would really work?
Yeah, and that's an interesting bit of history too, because when I was researching the book and learning that in 1990 we had 26 murders on the subway, and we had added a double-digit murder, roughly between 1 dozen and a little less than 2 dozen murders every year on the subways, give or take, from around the mid-1970s up until 1990, and that this was basically considered acceptable. There was an item in the New York Times, kind of not quite an editorial, but not quite an op-ed, that said, as long as you avoid the most dangerous passages, you'll be pretty safe. And so I was kind of thinking to myself, how did it ever get acceptable to have a double-digit number of murders on the subway? I mean, clearly that would never happen today. But I kind of got a very bad taste of that when, from 1997 through 2019, because the city and the state had addressed crime on the subway. You had Bill Bratton in 1990 come in to head up the transit police. Very simple, elegant solution. You stop the lower level crimes before they escalate to higher level crimes. And almost the closest controlled experiment on crime that you'll ever get, because nothing changed with the economy, nothing changed with whether people were good people or bad people, nothing changed with the school system, but within months you had violent crime drop by high double digits on the subway system, and basically stayed there for 25 years through good times and bad. So on the eve of COVID, we were down to 1 or 2 homicides a year on the subway, immediately jumped up to 7 murders, another 7. We exceeded double digits in 2022, and we exceeded double digits again in 2024. I think the good news is city voters clearly in moving away from the left wing and the kind of movement against preventative policing clearly have said, this is not acceptable, we're not going to put up with this level of violence. And the city has responded basically going back to what worked before. You see Commissioner Tisch doing the same thing and getting some results this quarter. It's not to say you can't change things so that your first fare evasion offense is a formal warning rather than getting a civil summons the first time. That the first fine can't be a little lower than $100. And the state has made these changes, but at some point, for chronic offenders in the transit system, much of this is driven by mental illness. We need much more accountability with getting people who are severely mentally ill the help that they are asking for when they're engaging in this behavior. But for people who are not mentally ill, you still do need the accountability where if you continually evade the fare, there has to be some consequence, even if you start with a day of community service, which very few people would want to do. So just sort of getting back to what worked 35 years ago continues to work today.
Yeah, somewhat similar. Sarah Feinberg had an op-ed in which she said, don't expect the subway to be a place to take care of the homeless, to take care of criminals and other issues. Get back to the foundational job of the transit system, running transit.
Right, and of course, a person experiencing, mental health crisis, the answer is not, you hand them summons or you put them in jail, but we need a much more effective regime of hospitalization. Sometimes you have to start with involuntary hospitalization, but longer term, what is the process for getting this person where they are able to function in society? Because multiple times over the past 5 years, these individuals have been the victims of subway homicide. You had 2 homeless people living on the subway back in 2022, stabbed to death, and The woman last December also living on subway and was set on fire in that horrific crime. And so these also become our victims of not having an adequate mental health system.
Are we taking questions now?
Yes, so we have a microphone. We have 2 microphones floating around, so raise your hand if you have a question. And then I have my first one right up here.
Hi, thanks. I'm wondering if you could comment, or if you are aware of a new book by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson called Abundance, arguing that we maybe went too far and have too many regulations and aren't being able to get things built. I guess specifically in New York, building transit is really expensive, and just your comments on the abundance agenda.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think both the term NIMBY and YIMBY, not in my backyard, and yes in my backyard, are meaningless terms. If you are a NIMBY, it really depends on what is being proposed in your backyard and whether that's actually a good idea or not, and how it's going to be regulated, and what is the infrastructure to support it. So, for example, if you live at the intersection of 5 subway lines and you're saying, I don't want apartment buildings in this neighborhood, we only want single-family homes, that doesn't make a lot of sense because the infrastructure there is to support it. But if you're living in an area where there's no public transit, there's already a traffic mess on the roads, and people want to rezone for multifamily housing, I think it is a reasonable question to say, what is the infrastructure to support this? So I think these questions are more complex and are elided by the YIMBY-NIMBY term. Whether abundance is good or not is what are we having in greater abundance? Do we want more of that thing or not? And yes, the environmental regulatory process can certainly be streamlined where there are time limits to make these decisions. Something like you've got an 18-month timeline, you've got a 2-year timeline, and so forth. But the reason for that is that the elected officials often hide behind the environmental process. And I think that is something that is glided over, that we haven't, the delays on something like California high-speed rail or continued delays to finishing 2nd Avenue subway, they're not really because of environmental regulations. They're just because this is not a priority of elected officials, that somebody has to make the decision and anger some people, and somebody also has to find the money and take that money away from an immediate need, and they don't want to do that. So they're trying to keep both camps happy and hide behind the environmental review process. And I would counsel about making it too easy because we're just going to make it easier to build coal mines in West Virginia, and we're still not going to get the transit because nobody really wants to build transit. You solved the wrong problem, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much for being here today. We've experienced some incredible progress with bike infrastructure over the last 20 years. I'm curious if you think that bike infrastructure is getting easier to build now than it was, let's say, 5 years into Bloomberg's administration, or into 5 years after Bloomberg started building bike lanes in earnest. And then second, what do we have to look forward to? Sam teased me with amazing bike pedestrian bridges from New York to Governor's Island and to New Jersey, and I still would love those, but I'm curious what you think will be achieved in the next 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, I remember the bike bridges from
Yes.
the Move New York plan, and this is also a good place for me to say, if we didn't have Sam, we would not have congestion pricing. If you are, hopefully someone reading my book 50 years ago, you will be the hero or the villain for people who don't like congestion pricing. But this is a case where, your dogged work with Charles, with Alex, over going back 50 years, that if you had given up when Congress forbid it in 1977, if you had given up when Bloomberg lost his battle in the state legislature. And I think that's a key lesson of New York City and state, that whatever you want to do is going to take a long time. You know, don't give up after a year or 10 years or 20 years or 50 years, and you know, stay healthy, because that's how long it is going to take for some of these things. I think it's gotten harder in the past few years just because of the environment of national politics, where if you are building a bike lane right now, you are resisting Trump, and many people, for many reasons, don't want to be in that position. But I think it will get easier again as that moment recedes. I was positively surprised during both the de Blasio administration and the Adams administration at how these projects have continued at a much slower pace, obviously, than the Bloomberg administration. And I think left to either de Blasio or Adams, particularly Adams, they never would have started this type of program on their own. You know, you needed someone like Bloomberg who would accept the immediate news blowback from putting parked cars in the middle of the street and making a dedicated bike lane, or building a place for pedestrians in Times Square. Neither de Blasio nor Adams would have spent political capital on that, but they haven't taken it away, and they have continued to go forward. You know, Adams, he bows down to political pressure on certain projects, but they have continued the wider bike lane on 6th Avenue. They continued building out the wider pedestrian areas on 9th and 8th Avenue. So much more marginal progress, but we continue to make progress. And I think once some of the acute crisis environments, both crime, both Trump, both the newness of congestion pricing, once those things go away and you get back to a more normal environment, whatever that is, some future mayor can continue to just quietly expand these things, and it becomes a non-news issue.
Thanks for mentioning the bike pedestrian bridges. You know, when I started working on congestion pricing, this beard was red, I had long hair, and you know, what we need is somebody like you, younger people, to maybe a 50-year window before you build them. We have not built a bridge to the Central Business District since 1909. The Manhattan Bridge was the last bridge. It's about time. I thought with the Amazon site, that seemed perfect to hook up with the Cornell Technion campus and then hook up with that promenade. So we call that the Queen's Ribbon. But the days of building bridges for cars are over in New York. We need to build them for people. So hope somebody here takes the mantle. I don't think I have another 50 years to work on it.
Donald J. Trump bicycle and pedestrian.
That's right, yes.
We have time for one more question. Why don't we,
Nobody on my side?
you know what? I got one. We've got,
All right, can you pass this to?
Hi. You mentioned some of the things that have gotten better since the lockdowns, that we've got more people, we've got people riding the city bikes again, people riding the subways again. The one thing that I see that hasn't changed is about fare evasion. I feel that a large number of the population has gotten out of the habit of paying the fare for buses and subways. Contrast this, I took a long weekend in Chicago last fall, bought my 3-day transit pass, rode lots of buses, rode lots of trains. Chicago's not paradise. It's not that they have perfect headways on the trains. They don't have clean stations. But the one thing I never saw was anybody fail to pay their fare. What can we do to get that back to where it was before?
Yeah, I think the data show that you're absolutely right. I mean, we went from fewer than 5% of people evading the fare for a very long time leading up to 2019 to having close to a third, and now it's actually 40% and above of people evading the bus fare, and closer to 20% of people evading the subway fare. So it's not to say that once in a while, someone just forgets all their methods of payment, although that's less credible now that you can just tap your credit card, or that someone just does not have the money that day. And that is why we have a system where you now get a warning, then you get a civil summons, then you get another civil summons. It does not escalate to a misdemeanor until at least 3 non-paid summonses, and even then, a misdemeanor, it does not equal spending any time at all in jail. You're given a desk appearance ticket, and then you show up to court later. But yes, the culture of paying the fare eroded during COVID. First, because the buses were free for a long time. I think the buses were free for close to a year, so people just got into the habit of getting on the back door. And just basically no enforcement. People, just human nature to get away with what you can get away with. So I think stepped up, consistent, escalating enforcement will continue to have some role to play in this. But since there's no political appetite for starting with stronger, more aggressive criminal enforcement, it takes much longer to get this message across than it took in 1990, where Bratton would arrest first-time fare beaters, and you would have to go and do your community service, and you learn that lesson very, very quickly. And that weeds out the people who are just doing it because they can get away with it, and allows for more concentration for chronic fare evaders who are driven by mental illness and who are committing other crimes in the transit system. But this is, I once asked a global designer of subway fare, architecture, how do we build a system where you can't evade the fare? And he said, you're never going to build that system. It's not a prison. By definition, you need to get in and out of it very quickly. So yes, the physical environment can be a little more of a deterrent, but it is not the answer. And I also once asked someone, what is the punishment in Japan if you evade the fare? And this person happened to be Japanese, couldn't actually come up with the answer because the idea of doing that was just so, nobody would do it. So nobody knows what the punishment is.